On Democracy by Robert A. Dahl. Voiced by the Catalyst Gamer. Chapter 7. Why Political Equality 2. Civic Competence. It may now come as an unpleasant surprise to learn that even if we accept intrinsic equality and the equal consideration of interests as sound moral judgments, we are not necessarily bound to endorse democracy as the best process for governing a state. The counter-claim of guardianship. To see why this is so, let us imagine that a member of a small group of fellow citizens says to you and others, "Like you, we also strongly believe in intrinsic equality, but we are not only deeply devoted to the common good, we also know better than most how to achieve it. As a result, we are much better fitted than the great majority of people to rule. If you will only grant us exclusive authority over the government, we will devote our wisdom and our labours to serving the general good. And in doing so, we will give equal consideration to the good and interests of all." The claim that government should be turned over to experts deeply committed to rule for the general good and superior to other in their knowledge of the means to achieve it, guardians, Plato called them, has always been the major rival to democratic ideas. Advocates of guardianships attack democracy at a seemingly vulnerable point. They simply deny that ordinary people are competent to govern themselves. They do not necessarily deny that human beings are intrinsically equal in the sense that we explored earlier. As in Plato's ideal republic, the guardians might be committed to serving the good of all and, at least by implication, might hold that all those under their guardianship are intrinsically equal in their good or interests. Advocates of guardianship in Plato's sense do not claim that the interests of the persons chosen as guardians are intrinsically superior to the interests of others. They contend that experts in governing, the guardians, would be superior in their knowledge of the general good and the best means to achieve it. The argument for this political guardianship makes a persuasive use of analogies. Partly analogies including expert knowledge and competence, a physician's superior knowledge on matters of sickness and health, for example, or a pilot's superior competence in guides us safely to our destination. Why not therefore allow those with superior competence in governing to make crucial decisions about the health of the state? To the pilot, the government towards its persons are invariably the best judges of their own interests. Children obviously are not. Others, usually parents, must serve as their guardians until they are competent to take care of themselves. That all adults can also be mistaken about their interests, about the best means to attain their goals, is demonstrated by common experience. Most of us come to regret some of our past decisions. We admit, mistaken. What is more, almost all of us do rely on experts to make crucial decisions that bear strongly and directly on our well-being, happiness, health, future, even our survival. Not just physicians, surgeons and pilots, but in our increasingly complex society, a myriad of others. So if we let experts make decisions on important matters like these, why shouldn't we turn governments over to experts? Attractive as it may seem at times, the argument for guardianship rather than democracy fails to take sufficient account of some crucial defects in the analogy. To delegate certain subordinate decisions to experts is not equivalent to ceding final control over major decisions. As an old adage has it, experts should be kept on a tap, not on top. Experts may possess knowledge that is superior to yours in some important respects, but a good physician may know better than you how to diagnose your illness, what cause it is likely to run, how severe it will be, how best to treat it, and whether it is in fact treatable. You may reasonably choose to follow your physician's recommendations, but that does not mean that you should cede to your physician the power to decide whether you should undertake the course of treatment she or he recommends. Likewise, it is one thing for government officials to seek the aid of experts, but it is quite another for political elite to possess the power to decide on the laws and policies you will be compelled to obey. Personal decisions made by individuals are not equivalent to decisions made and enforced by the government of a state. The fundamental issue is in the debate over guardianship versus democracy is not whether as individuals we must sometimes put our trust in experts. The issue is who or what group should have the final say in decisions made by the government of a state. You might reasonably wish to turn certain personal decisions over to someone more expert on those matters than you, like your doctor, accountant, lawyer, airplane pilot, or others. But it does not follow automatically that it would be reasonable for you to turn over a political elite the authority to control the major decisions of the government of the state, decisions that would be enforced if need be by coercion, imprisonment, perhaps even death. To govern a state well requires much more than strictly scientific knowledge. Governing is not a science, in the sense that physics or chemistry, or even in some respects medicine, is a science. This is true for several reasons. For one thing, virtually all important decisions about policies, whether personal or government, require ethical judgments. To make a decision about the ends that government policies should be designed to achieve, justice, equity, fairness, happiness, health, survival, security, well-being, equality, or whatnot. It is to make ethical judgment. Ethical judgments are not scientific judgments in the usual sense. Then, too, good ends often conflict with one another, and resources are limited. Consequently, decisions about policies, whether personal or governmental, almost always require judgments about trade-offs, a balancing of different ends. For example, achieving economic equality may impair economic incentives. The cost of benefits for the elderly may impose on the young. Expenditures on generations now living may impose costs on generations to come. Preserving a wilderness area may come at the price of jobs for miners and timber workers. Judgments about trade-offs among different ends are not scientific. Empirical evidence is important and necessary, but it is never sufficient. In deciding how much we should sacrifice one end, good or goal, in order to attain some measure of another, we necessarily move well beyond anything that strictly scientific knowledge can provide. There is another reason why decisions about policies require judgments that are not strictly scientific. Even if the ends of policy decisions can be agreed on in a general way, there is almost always considerable uncertainty and conflict over the means, how the end may be best achieved, the desirability, the feasibility, the acceptability, and likely consequences of alternative means. What are the best means of taking care of the poor, the jobless, the homeless? How are the interests of children best protected and advanced? How large a budget is needed for military defense, and for what purposes? it is impossible to demonstrate. I believe that a group exists or could be created who possesses scientific or expert knowledge that provides definitive answers to questions like these. Would we rather entrust the repair of our car to a theoretical physicist or to a good automobile mechanic? To govern a state well takes more than knowledge. It also requires incorruptibility, a firm resistance to all the enormous temptations of power, and a continuing and inflexible dedication to the public good rather than benefits for oneself or one's group. Because experts may be qualified to serve as your agents does not mean that they are qualified to serve as your rulers. Advocates of guardianship make not just one claim, but two. A ruling elite can be created, they contend, whose members are both definitely superior to others in their knowledge of the ends to a good government should seek, and the best means to achieve those ends, and so deeply dedicated to pursuing the public good that they can safely be entrusted with the sovereign authority to govern the state. As we have just seen, the first claim is highly dubious, but even if it could be shown to be justified, that would not be itself support the second claim. Knowledge is one thing, power is another. The likely effects of power on those who wield it were succinctly summed up in 1887 by an English baron, Lord Acton, in a famous statement. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. A century earlier, William Pitt, a British statesman of vast experience in political life, had made a similar observation. Unlimited power, he said in a speech in Parliament, is apt to corrupt the minds of those who possess it. This was also the general view among the members of the American Constitution, nor Convention in 1787, who were not lacking in experience on this question. Sir, there are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men, said the oldest delegate, Benjamin Franklin. These are the ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money. One of the youngest delegates, Alexander Hamilton, concurred. Men love power. And one of the most experienced and influential delegates, George Mason, concurred. From the nature of men, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will always, when they can, increase it. However wise and worthy the members of the ruling elite entrusted with the power to govern a state may be when they first take power, in a few years or a few generations they are likely to abuse it. If human history provides any lessons, one surely is that though through corruptions, nepotism, and advancement of individual and group interests, and abuse of their monopoly over the state, coercive power to suppress criticism, extract wealth from their subjects, and ensure their obedience by coercion, the guardians of a state are likely to turn into despots. Finally, to design a utopia is one thing, to bring it about is quite another. An advocate of guardianship confronts a host of formidable practical problems. How is the guardianship to be inaugurated? Who will draw up the constitution, so to speak, and who will put it into action? How will the first guardians be chosen? If guardianship is to depend on some way on the consent of the governed, and not outright coercion, how will consent be obtained? In whatever way the guardians are first selected, will they then choose their successors, like the members of a club? If so, won't the system run a high risk of degenerating from an aristocracy of talent into an oligarchy of birth? Yet, if the existing guardians do not choose their successors, who will? How will abusive and exploitive guardians be discharged? And so on. The competence of citizens to govern. Unless advocates of guardianship can provide convincing solutions to the problems in their prescription that I have just described, prudence and reason require, in my judgment, that we reject their case. In rejecting the case of guardianship, in effect, we conclude, among the adults, no persons are so definitively better qualified than others to govern that they should be entrusted with complete and final authority over the government of the state. But if we should not be governed by guardians, by whom should we be governed? By ourselves? On most matters, we tend to believe that unless a highly convincing case can be made to the contrary, every adult should be allowed to judge what is best for his or her own good or interests. We apply this presumption in favour of personal autonomy, only to adults, however, and not to children. From experience, we assume instead that parents must act as guardians to protect the interests of their children. If parents fail, perhaps the government may need to step in. Sometimes we also reject the presumption of persons of adult age who are judged to lack a normal capacity to look out for themselves. Like children, they too may need guardians. Yet unlike children for whom the presumption has been overruled by law and convention, with adults the presumption cannot be likely overridden. The potential for abuse is all too obvious. Consequently, we require an independent finding, a judicial process of some kind. If we assume that with few exceptions adults should be entrusted with the right to make personal decisions about what is in their best interest, why should we reject this view in governing the state? The key question here is no longer whether adults are generally content to make the personal decisions they face daily, or competent. The question now is whether most adults are sufficiently competent to participate in governing the state. Are they? To arrive at the answer, consider again some conclusions we've reached in the last several chapters. Democracy confers many advantages on its citizens. Citizens are strongly protected against despotic rulers. They possess fundamental political rights. In addition, they also enjoy a wide sphere of freedoms. As citizens, they acquire means for protecting and advancing their most important persons of interest. They can also participate in deciding on the laws under which they will live. They can exercise a wide range of moral autonomy, and they possess unusual opportunities for personal development. If we conclude that democracy provides these advantages over non-democratic systems of government, several fundamental questions arise. Why should the advantages of democracy be restricted to some persons and not others? Why shouldn't they be available to all adults? If a government ought to give equal consideration to the good of each person, should not all adults have the right to participate in deciding what laws and policies would best achieve the ends they seek? Whether their ends are restricted narrowly to their good, or include the good of all. If no persons are definitively better qualified to govern, that they should be entrusted with complete and final authority over the government of the state, then who is better qualified to participate than all the adults who are subject to the laws? From the conclusions implied by these questions, another follows. that I would put this way. Except on a very strong showing to the contrary, in rare circumstances, protected by laws, every adult subject to the laws of the state should be considered to be sufficiently well qualified to participate in democratic process of governing that state. A fifth democratic standard, inclusion. The conclusion to which the argument of this chapter now points is that if you are deprived of an equal voice in government of a state, the chances are quite high that your interests will not be given the same attention as the interests of those who do have a voice. If you have no voice, who will speak up for you? Who will defend your interests if you cannot? And not just your interests as an individual. If you happen to be a member of an entire group excluded from participation, how will the fundamental interests of that group be protected? The answer is clear. The fundamental interests of adults who are denied opportunities to participate in government will not be adequately protected and advanced by those who govern. The historical evidence on this point is overwhelming. As we saw in our brief survey of the evolution of democracy, nobles and burghers in England, discontented with the arbitrary way monarchs imposed burdens on them without their consent, demanded and gained the right to participate in government. Centuries later, the middle classes, believing that their fundamental interests were ignored, in turn demanded and gained that right. There are, and elsewhere, the continuing legal and de facto exclusion of women, slaves, poor persons, and manual workers, among others. Left, the members of these groups poorly protected against exploitation and abuse, even in countries like Great Britain and the United States, where the government was otherwise largely democratic. In 1861, John Stuart Mill contended that because the working classes were denied suffrage, no one in government spoke up for their interests. Although he did not believe, he said, that those who participated in government deliberately intended to sacrifice the interests of the working classes to their own, nonetheless he asked, "Does Parliament, or almost any of the members composing it, ever for an instant look at any with the eyes of a working man? When a subject arises in which the labourers are such, have an interest, is it regarded from any point of view but that of the employers of labour?" The same question could have been asked about slaves in ancient and modern republics, about women throughout history until the 20th century, about many persons nominally free but effectively deprived of democratic rights, such as blacks in southern United States until the 1960s, and in southern Africa until the 1990s, and elsewhere. Yes, individuals and groups may sometimes be mistaken about their own good. Certainly they may sometimes misperceive what is in their own best interests. But the preponderant weight of human experience informs us that no group of adults can safely grant to others the power to govern over them. Which leads us to a conclusion of crucial importance. You may recall that when I discussed the criteria for democracy in Chapter 4, I postponed a discussion of the fifth, inclusion of adults. See Figure 4 on page 38. This chapter and the last provides, I believe, with an ample reason for a conclusion that the democratic government of a state must satisfy that standard. Let me now put it this way. Full inclusion. The citizen body in a democratically governed state must include all persons subject to the laws that state except transients and persons proved to be incapable of caring for themselves. Unsettled problems. To reject the argument for guardianship and adopt political equality as an ideal still leaves some difficult questions. Don't citizens and government officials need help from experts? Indeed, they do. The importance of experts and specialized knowledge for democratic government to function well is undeniable. Public policy is often so complex, and may be growing steadily more so, that no government could make satisfactory decisions without the help of highly informed specialists. Civil service. Just as each of us in our personal decisions must sometimes depend on experts for guidance, and must delegate important decisions to them, so too must governments, including democratic governments. How best to satisfy democratic criteria? Maintain a satisfactory degree of political equality, and yet rely on experts and expert knowledge in making public decisions. Present a serious problem. One that it would be foolish for advocates of democratic government to ignore. But I shall have to ignore it here. If citizens are to be competent, won't they need political, social institutions to help make them so? Unquestionably. Opportunities to gain an enlightened understanding of public matters are not just part of the definition of democracy. They are a requirement for democracy. Nothing I have said is meant to imply that a majority of citizens may not make mistakes. They can and do. This is precisely why advocates of democracy have always placed a high value on education. And civic education requires not only formal schooling, but public discussion, deliberation, debates, controversy, the ready availability of reliable information, and other institutions of free society. But suppose the institutions for developing competent citizens are weak, and many citizens don't know enough to protect their fundamental values and interests. What are we to do? In searching for an answer, it is helpful to review the conclusions we have reached up to this point. We have adopted the principle of intrinsic equality. We ought to regard the good of every human being as intrinsically equal to that of any other. We have applied the principle to the government of a state. In arriving at decisions, the government must give equal consideration to the good and interests of every person bound by those decisions. We have rejected guardianship as a satisfactory way of applying the principle. Among adults, no persons are so deliberately better qualified than others to govern that they should be entrusted with complete and final authority over the government of a state. Instead, we have accepted full inclusion. The citizen body in a democratically governed state must include all persons subject to the laws of the state, except transients and persons proved to be incapable of caring for themselves. Therefore, if the institutions for civic education are weak, only one satisfactory solution remains. They must be strengthened. We who believe in democratic goals are obligated to search for ways by which citizens can acquire the competence they need. Perhaps the institutions for civic education that we created in democratic countries during the 19th and 20th centuries are no longer adequate. If this is so, then democratic countries will need to create new institutions to supplement the old ones. Concluding comments and preview. We have now explored about half the territory laid out in Figure 3, page 29, yet we have barely peeked into the other half, the basic institutions that are necessary for advancing the goal of democracy, and the conditions, social, economic, and others, that favour the development of maintenance in these democratic political institutions. We'll explore these in the following chapters we turn to, and then from goals to actualities.